Good morning and welcome to Beef-Link TV, your daily dose of industry information. This morning we welcome back James Shorey and we're here to explore Scope 3 emissions in more detail. So firstly, James, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us again. In our last episode on sustainability, we touched on Scope 3, Scope 2 and Scope 1. But can you remind our members what Scope 3 emissions in particular actually are?
Yes, of course. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol set out Scopes 1, 2 and 3 as a way to measure a company's emissions and their impact on the environment. Scope 1 and 2 are very much your emissions as a business, like the physical energy you're using, gas you're using, the cars that are in your fleet. Whereas Scope 3 is much more about your ecosystem and your wider impact. So it could be anything from your business travel to your waste contractor and all of the suppliers that you work with. So it's anywhere between 75 to 90% of your company emissions, or even higher, depending on the business. And the reason why it's so complicated is just because think about the impact that you have and all the different other businesses that you work with as a business yourself. So what they've done is they've split it into 15 different categories within Scope 3. And for product businesses, there's a lot of categories like use of product and end of life of product, which are only relevant to them. So for a service-based company like a freight forwarder, those things aren't going to be relevant, but it doesn't mean your emissions are going to be any smaller. It just means that your emissions are going to be categorized in a different way. So you'll find that a lot of your emissions in Scope 3 will be in Scope 3 category 1, which is purchased goods and services, which is effectively your supply chain. So all of the businesses that you work with. So it could be all of the logistics businesses you work with, all of the clients that you are doing the work for, all of their associated emissions will fall into that category 1, which again, Scope 3 can be anywhere from 75 to 90% of your emissions, but Scope 3 category 1 is an even bigger proportion of Scope 3. So it's by far the biggest area to tackle.
Sure. So how do you measure Scope 3 emissions in general?
Yes, so there's two approaches when you're thinking about measuring Scope 3 in a particular category 1, your supply chain. There's activity-based and there's spend-based. So spend-based is by far the easiest. You effectively ask a business, so let's say you have a big supplier, and let's say they are a £100 million turnover business. You need to ask them for their Scope 1, 2 and 3, and let's say that you spend £1 million with them. So proportionally, your purchasing power makes up 1% of their business. Therefore, you are responsible for 1% of their emissions. But so if you get their Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, you can basically say we're responsible for 1% of that. Sure. And that's part of our Scope 3. Okay. That's the spend-based. The activity-based is a much more in-depth. You would basically ask your supplier to give you line item by line item all of the services that they did for you, what the intensity was, if it was a physical good that you ordered, like how did that good get from site A to site B, by what method, was it an electric vehicle, was it a plane, things like that. So I would say spend-based analysis is by far the easiest and can give you a really good heat map of your emissions, whereas activity-based is probably what you want to aim for to get a really good representation of your true impact on the environment.
Sure. So, and finally, once you have measured them as a business, how do you then reduce those emissions?
Yes. So Scope 3 is all about who you work with. So ultimately, to reduce those emissions, you have two options. You can either choose better suppliers and better waste contractors and better travel operators to work with yourselves, businesses that have less of an impact on the environment. So by choosing those businesses, your Scope 3 will reduce itself. Or alternatively, you can work with your suppliers to help them reduce their emissions. So you can help them with education, you can help them measure their emissions. You can, if there's any tools like Planet you want to sort of introduce them to help them start their sustainability journeys. All of these result in all the business community that you work with being more sustainable. And that's how you reduce your Scope 3 emissions.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you again, James, for joining us.
Thank you.
And for educating our members on this topic.
Thank you.
If you missed our last episode on sustainability, we'll pop a link in the description below, along with James's contact details. That's all for today's episode of Beef-Link TV, your daily dose of industry information.